Yeah, great.
Well, welcome everybody to this short discussion about a new book by Ted Reese on Henryk Grossman. And Ted is here with me to discuss the book. And so to introduce Ted, perhaps Ted could explain who he is, what he does, and where he is, so that viewers have a better idea.
Thanks very, very much, Michael. Thanks a lot for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss Henryk Grossman and my book. So I'm situated in London, in Britain. I've studied Marxism for around a decade, I suppose. Well, ever since the financial crash in 2008, I've been, investigating economics more and more and becoming more and more of a Marxist economist. And yeah, so I suppose about 7 or 8 years ago, I was introduced to Henryk Grossman and the abridged English version of his Law of Accumulation.
Yeah.
And was hooked by it, because I found it so clarifying. Obviously, Capital is a dense text and difficult to get your head around all of it. And yeah, Grossman's book, albeit in the abridged form, was very clarifying. And yeah, I just felt so strongly that this book needed to be more widely read and appreciated. And so when I started writing my own theory, based on the crisis and the ongoing development of automation, which I know you've written a lot about as well, I cited Grossman a lot in my work, and then I was approached by Zero Books to write something based on a little bit about his life and his work as well. So,
but Ted, you're not an academic. You're an activist, are you, or what?
I haven't been particularly active in the last 3 years for health reasons. But I was before that. Yeah, I was in a socialist organization, mainly doing housing activism.
Right.
And yeah, I left that organization about 3 or 4 years ago, and to concentrate on writing some independent work and developing.
Sounds a bit like me. Although, of course, I'm giving you a few years. So, yes, you said Grossman caught your eye as it did me. Perhaps you could say why Grossman caught your eye, and what brings it home to you, the need for viewers here to recognize Henryk Grossman. Perhaps you could briefly say who he is and what he's written, and then we can discuss why you in particular wanted to take up Grossman's work.
Yeah, so he was a Polish Jew, is situated in Poland in the run-up to the First World War, and he became a socialist at 15. And Poland was obviously partitioned by the Austrian Empire at that time, and he was quite well off. He was from a well-off family. I think his dad owned a mine, and so he had a very good education and a fairly decent upbringing. And though he recognized that as an upper class Jewish person, he didn't suffer the same degree of discrimination as Polish Jewish working class people, he did have that affinity with them, and recognized their struggles and wanted to enhance the struggle for Jewish liberation and Polish Jewish liberation. And so that was part of his motivation for getting involved with politics as a student, as well as being opposed to occupational forces. And he started attending socialist political meetings in his early teens. And according to him, he quickly sort of like a real
He
thorough
moved
grasp
towards
of the economy.
Marxism, did he? Yeah.
Yeah, and he quickly like got a thorough grasp of it.
Yeah.
You know, he mastered it. That was the word I was looking for. He quickly mastered the Marxist text.
Yeah.
And yeah, and he started writing on student socialist magazines. He eventually split from the Social Democratic Party of Poland and formed his own independent Jewish organization, although he tried to do it in a non-sectarian way that associated it to the existing Marxist parties, which were, of course, second international parties at the time. And then he eventually sort of, after the Russian Revolution, he joined the Communist Party in Poland. So he therefore a more decisive split from the SDP type parties. Then he was exiled and he was allowed to stay in Germany so long as he didn't join the Communist Party there. And there he joined the Frankfurt School and wrote his, having written a series of essays before this, but he then wrote The Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System in 1929.
So Ted, what do you think is the main message of Grossman's work for Marxist and Marxist economists? Why does he stand out in your view? What specific message do you want to tell the viewers that Grossman is delivering?
Well, the main one is that crisis or recession or economic contraction, whatever you want to call it, is inherent to capitalism. And he shows this in a scientific way, in a way that reestablishes Marx's method, quite crucially, because the Marxists that had been writing since Marx died, or at least since Engels died, and again, they're kind of like second international Marxists, had really thrown Marx's method out of the window, or not taken it up thoroughly. Maybe they'd taken it up in a kind of a one-sided way, whereas Grossman sort of takes up this more of a two-sided method that Marx used, which he describes as the method of successive approximation, where he uses the mathematical schemas to sort of lay out a pattern of capitalist accumulation and show that it must break down. So the main thing is he shows that capitalist accumulation must break down.
How does he show that, Ted? How does he show, what's his theory of crisis? How does he show that there's a breakdown tendency in capitalism?
So Otto Bauer had used a schema, you know, loosely based on Marx's schemas, to show that capital accumulation could accumulate harmoniously and indefinitely. His schema showed that there was a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, but that it didn't matter was the conclusion, because accumulation continued unhindered. And he does this, so he starts with a certain amount of constant capital, which is the value of the means of production, and a certain amount of variable capital, which is the value of labor power or total wages. So I think it's something like 120,000 constant capital to 80,000 variable capital. And constant capital grows per cycle or per year, whichever you want to use, by 10%, and variable capital by 5%.
Mm-hmm.
And surplus value grows at a constant rate of 100%. So that 2-to-1 ratio of constant capital to variable capital is based on, so this whole schema is obviously an abstraction, a simplification of like a pure capitalism. And that 2-to-1 ratio is important because it means that we're not abstracting too far away from reality, because we know from empirical data, even back then it was obvious from empirical data, that constant capital tended to grow faster than the outlay on variable capital.
Yeah.
Grossman actually says 2-to-1 is far too shallow a ratio and it should be higher, but he adopts Bauer's schema to expose it on its own basis.
I think Grossman was right. My empirical data suggests that generally the organic composition of capitalism, what we're just talking about, is certainly higher than 2 in most countries, if 3, 4, 5 even.
Yeah, and it will tend to keep rising. So Grossman follows it through basically beyond 4 years, and eventually gets to year 35, 36, and it breaks down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's despite a greater amount of surplus value being dedicated to accumulation, the system breaks down because you end up with the amounts that can be dedicated to capitalist consumption disappearing, which means the motive for being a capitalist disappears.
Yeah, they're no longer rich, they're even starving themselves.
But that compels, this is the other part that's important about Grossman, is this manifestation compels the capitalist class to attack the working class in terms of sort of redirecting surplus value away from what's being dedicated to wages back towards their own consumption and towards further accumulation, if accumulation is to continue. So, and then Grossman also shows that the crisis.
Frozen there. So
so the crisis is needed to resolve the crisis, Grossman shows. There's the slump in economic output, investment having fallen because the incentive to invest falls, and then there's a fall in demand. That incentivizes panic selling on the market, prices fall, and therefore that makes it cheaper to invest in production again. So this process of devaluation re-enables the capitalists to invest in means of production that they previously couldn't afford to buy, essentially.
Right.
And so accumulation can start again on a higher basis. Obviously, there are other counter tendencies as well, but the reason this is important is, again, it shows that capitalism needs the crisis, and that's inherent to capitalism.
One of the criticisms of Grossman is that he has a theory of breakdown, as it's called, and that basically he's saying that capitalism is going straight down a hole into breakdown. And yet capitalism continues to survive, as we've seen, for a series of booms and stumps. So Grossman got it wrong, is one of the criticisms made of Grossman. What do you think of that?
I mean, you could argue that he got his timing wrong, because he did say it was at some point during the Second World War, he did say something like, he is quoted as saying the objective situation for capitalism is hopeless. So he did get it wrong at the time. If you take that quote seriously, I mean, you don't know how much of a throwaway quote it was. But I mean, I do personally take from his work that it shows that capitalism is unsustainable. I think it proves that capitalism can't last forever. The question is how long can it last, and did he fail to show that? Well, yes, he did. He failed to show how long capitalism can last for, because that's impossible to show. We don't know exactly how long.
See, well, I always answer that point by saying, well, actually, if you think of the title of Grossman's book, it's a theory of breakdown and crises. He's saying that you have a series of crises, but we're heading towards capitalism can't last forever. This process is built into the way in which the tendency of the rate of profit to fall exerts itself. But it can get out of situations through slumps, through attacking the workers for a period of time again. And in fact, that's what we see. We see a series of cycles, but also a general tendency for the profitability of capital to fall over time. So it's increasingly difficult. You could argue it that way, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously he's not saying there has to be a final crisis before capitalism, before we can get rid of capitalism. If the workers, if the working class organizes in a sufficient way and has the capacity to do so, then it can get rid of the system and introduce a new one. But I would argue that he shows to a certain extent that it does take the crisis of capitalism to raise consciousness and serve as that impetus to organization in a sufficient way. Obviously, there have been socialist revolutions in the past before a final breakdown of capitalism, but then they've all been more or less, pretty much all of them have been rolled back to some certain extent.
So another criticism of Grossman, he's mechanical. He just has an economic mechanical theory of breakdown, and that there's no role for the working class as an agency for change, for a better society. And he just looks at it purely mechanically. Would you think that was a fair criticism?
Not at all. I really don't. As I say, he shows that the capitalist class is compelled to attack the working class, and that the working class is therefore compelled to fight back. We're seeing it in Britain now. You know, we've had a fairly dormant workers' movement in this country, but now that now that we've got this high inflation, which the central banks have, you know, partially pursued in order to attack wages, you know, the working class in this country is organizing on a scope that we haven't seen for maybe 30 odd years. So, you know, the practice is matching the theory at the moment.
So I think you've got on your phone a image of your book, if you could.
I'm afraid I don't have an actual copy with me today.
Well, I'm sure they can chase it up,
which is a bit
there you go.
silly on my part.
That's The End of Capitalism, the thought of Henryk Grossman by Ted Reese. Now, Ted, to finish in a way, there's been a number of works about Grossman over the last, particularly, of course, by Rick Kuhn, his biography, and of course, he's editing with others nearly all of Grossman's works now, and they're coming out through Brill, which is a publisher with historical materialism on a regular basis, which is great. What do you think your book adds to the critical review of Grossman's work and the importance that it places upon Grossman's work for us as Marxists? What's your book add, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's important just to add to it anyway, because there's such little, relatively little written about him, I would argue. And it serves as an introduction to both him as a socialist and a theorist, and how important he was as a Marxist theorist, as I would argue the preeminent Marxist theorist of the 20th century.
I think I would agree with you there. That's the most important thing that viewers should be aware of. I mean, Grossman is essential reasoning for Marxists who want to understand Marxist economics. And he's definitely the biggest exponent of that in the 20th century. There've been others, you could argue, Ernest Mandel and so on, but they don't match Grossman's rigor and theoretical understanding and the ability to explain beyond that into the nature of imperialism and so on. There's so many different things in the book, which I think are valuable. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I would argue that Grossman's description and analysis of imperialism is better than Lenin's, which is also a bit of a controversial thing to say on the communist left.
I think I'll tend to agree with you again.
Yeah, I mean, Lenin's analysis is very good, don't get me wrong. I just think Grossman adds a little bit that Lenin misses. So yeah, the book is a introduction and a summary of him as a socialist, his politics and his theoretical analysis, and that includes, you know, his discussions with Paul Matic and, you know, regarding the German Revolution and things like that, which I think are very insightful, because he does link it to his economic theory quite clearly as well, and he's very good at sort of summarizing or taking a step back and sort of looking at what went wrong. Obviously, it's hard to summarize, but you know, he was quite critical of the Communist Party during that period. He felt like the united front from below tactic was a mistake and things like that. And it's interesting. It's interesting because he relates it to the depth of the economic crisis. He sort of says, well, some of the opportunism is a symptom of perhaps the crisis not being deep enough, along with like the immaturity of the workers' movement and things like that.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's probably all we've got time for briefly, because it's only a brief introduction to the book. But just remind us again of the title, Ted, and where we can get it.
So it's The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman. It's published with Zero Books, and it's, you know, you can buy
It's on
it
the usual
Amazon.
places, is it? Amazon, etc. If you're forced to go there, yeah.
Yeah, if you can find somewhere better.
Well, go to Zero, maybe.
Yeah, straight to Zero.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just